Welcome, everyone. It's always a bit odd sometimes to start an event like this and not be able to see really who's here. We have now 60 participants, so I'm just going to trust that even though I can't see you, I can see people saying they can see and hear us. So we'll trust that we are all here together. So I want to welcome you all and thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us for this conversation today. I think we're going to have a really, really interesting conversation. I'm really excited to be here and be your host and moderator for today. My name is Cynthia Nordorfer, and I am a board member of Food Matters Manitoba. I've been on the board since May of 2020, and in my day job, I work for an NGO based here in Winnipeg that works on food security internationally. And so I'm interested in food security internationally, but also very much interested in the issues here at home. I want to start, before we go any further, just start with a land acknowledgement. And today, even though we're meeting virtually, many of us gathered on Zoom today. We live and work on Treaty 1 territory, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I ask that we abide by the treaties made with these nations, and that we live well on this land together. On a personal note, I just also wanted to add my own land acknowledgement, just my personal land acknowledgement. I've lived here on Treaty 1 land for almost 20 years, always within a stone's throw of the Assiniboine River. But how I was born and raised on Upper Canada Treaty Number 3 lands in Ontario, otherwise known as Between the Lakes Treaty, in Southern Ontario in the city of Guelph, which is a traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And those lands were purchased by the British in 1784 when they were seeking to find land for loyalists arriving in the territory after the American Revolutionary War. On my mother's side, I traced my roots back to a family arriving. Samuel Green arrived with his son Daniel from the United States, from New Jersey, onto those lands in 1783. And so those lands, those Treaty 3 lands have been hosting my family for a very long time. My father was welcomed onto those same lands as an immigrant in the 1950s. And so I also acknowledge the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, whose traditional territory has nurtured my family for almost 250 years. So before we go any further, just want to do a few housekeeping items as well. Katie, you will see Katie is here as well. And Katie is available for tech support. Her screen name is, for me, it's up at, just above me, Food Matters Manitoba Tech Support. So Katie, I don't know if you want to turn on your camera just to wave for everyone, just so they know who you are behind the camera there. So please let Katie know through direct chat if you need any assistance with Zoom, if you're running into any technical problems. She can also be reached at communications@foodmattersmanitoba.ca by email if you're having problems with Zoom functions. We also have some other help here. Olivia is a fourth-year practicum student from Menno Simons. Olivia, maybe you can wave as well. She's working with Food Matters Manitoba this term, and she's here today to help us collect and share questions with the panelists for the event. Her screen name is Questions for the Panel, and it's Olivia. So Olivia, she's got her hand up there waving. So we're going to have questions. We'll be taking questions after we have a few discussions with our panelists, about two-thirds of the way through. And so during the conversation, we do encourage you to put questions in the chat box if you have questions that come up that you want to pose while people are speaking. So please do be sure to put those in the chat box, and Olivia will be monitoring those for us. So before I welcome Bobby to open our event, we're hoping to just get a sense of who's joining. I see now we're up to 68 people. So we wanted to get a bit of a sense of who do we have in our virtual room here with us this afternoon. So if you don't mind, if you can use your internet browser or your smartphone and go to www.menti.com and enter the code you see on Zoom. So the code you should enter is 12682036. So you'll see on the screen menti.com and the code 12682036. And we'd like everyone just to answer a quick question so we can get a sense of who do we have here. And we'd like you to introduce yourselves and really say just what hat are you wearing in bringing to this conversation today. I know some of us may be here because of our day jobs, or we may be here because of personal interest. So just want to get to know what hat you're wearing today. So the link should also be in the chat. So we'll reveal the results of that in about 10 minutes. So if people could take some time now just to do that and let us know again what hat you're wearing today. And so when you're done, if you could leave your browser open, we will have another question for you at the end of the panel discussion. A reminder, if you're having any questions with technical or issues with technical difficulties, do check in with Katie for help. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing Bobby Aptigan, who's going to open our event for us. Bobby was raised in Norway House, and but grew up in Churchill, Manitoba. He is an Capawace. Sorry, I knew I was going to stumble over that. He has been sharing teachings and sharing knowledge of elders for 21 years, and we're very honored to have him join us here today to open our event and share with us. So Bobby, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for that introduction also. So first of all, I just want to say thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing, the nature of the work that you're doing, and ensuring that something as basic as food is available to everybody. And it's sad to say that we have so many people that struggle just to have basic meal every day. And the work that you guys are doing is very valuable. Thank you for your willingness to work with First Nations communities, and also thank you for acknowledging this land treaty 1 they call it, but for me, I understand things a little bit different according to the teachings of the elders. But always grateful to Mother Earth for everything that she does to provide for the human family. And so in the prayer today, I'll be asking Creator to allow the grandmothers, those good spirits, to sit with you guys, to guide your hearts and your minds so that they're in balance with each other when you go to do your work in the community, so that you're able to see whatever visions is necessary that'll help you to understand a path towards achieving your goals in terms of providing other programs to First Nations communities so that they can be self-sustaining as much as possible in that regard. Also, when I'm praying too, I'm giving thanks to the grandmother and grandfathers for all the good medicines and wisdom that they share. But I'm also giving thanks to Mother Earth, to all of our relatives in the Sky Nation, the spiritual nation, and the natural world. And when you were speaking there, I was thinking about for us when we're doing our ceremonies, because our way of life is not only a physical thing, like our worldview, our perspective is about spirit as well as physical. And when we're doing a feast and we're having a prayer, a blessing of that food, say something like berries, for instance, we're giving thanks to Father Sun, Grandfather Sun for going into those berries, Grandmother Moon for going into those berries. We're giving thanks to the Thunderbirds for bringing the rain and sharing their spirit with those berries, and also Mother Earth for sharing her spirit with these berries. And we know that all these different spiritual entities are going to nurture us, our bodies, but also our minds and our spirit. And when you think about things that way, for us, there's a little bit more intimacy in terms of understanding your relationship to all those that give their bodies to us so that we can have food for the day. And that it's not only a physical thing, but that's just the nature of our outlook anyway. And how we, like, it's just a small part of how we approach participating in something like, having a dinner or something like that. And the languages will tell us about it more, but like something like the moose which eats just medicine on a daily basis. When we have that moose, we have their medicine. When we have the berries, we have their medicine. And I'd like to see that those good medicines come back to our people from all the First Nations communities, because I know each and every First Nation community is struggling in some regard in terms of the kids, that go to school. There's programming there because the kids don't get, enough food at home, and they shouldn't be like that. They shouldn't have to rely on anybody outside their home to have food. And so what's happening now is that a lot of our people are very unhealthy because of the food that are available to them right now. But there was a time when our people were known to be one of the healthiest people in the world because of the nature of the food that was here, that was meant for our DNA, meant for our way of life, and the relationship that we had with the land and we had with those natural relatives. So I pray now way too that our people are open to working with you guys in order to understand and get back to strengthening their relationship with food and with natural food and with the natural relatives. So that's how I'll be praying. That's my hopes for everyone involved today, that they're able to have clarity and able to understand their role in making sure that something like this moves forward. The way I'll be praying right now will be through song. And as I'm talking right now, just from the word go, my mind is already in prayer. How I'm talking to Creator, and how I'm talking to the ancestors, how I'm talking to the grandmothers and grandfathers, our spiritual helpers, all of our relatives. And I'm just introducing that to you guys so you guys know where I'm at. And I don't know what song I'm going to sing, but all the songs I sing are prayer songs. And I just want to give thanks to each and every one of you again for the work that you're doing, and whatever challenges and obstacles that you guys may come up against. I hope that you guys have find and see a kind way of overcoming those challenges and obstacles, so that no anger goes into the work, no fear goes into the work. It's just all good stuff that goes into the work, because when you put anger or frustration into your work, then nothing ever good really comes out of it in the long run. It's not as positive, has a positive impact as you just learn how to overcome yourself and overcome challenges and obstacles in a kinder way. So that's one thing I'll pray for you guys as well, and also for your own well-being, your own health, and for your families. And like I said, just good luck with everything that you guys are doing, and understanding the difference nationality or different peoples too in different areas. Just how you approach them. You always ask for permission, their permission to enter their home, the territory. And one thing else. Sorry, I digress here, but one other thing that I was thinking about while you were opening was that there was a time when nobody starved in our communities, and that wasn't too long ago. Even up until the 80s. 70s and 80s for sure, there was a time when you walked into anybody's home in any First Nation community, the first thing you were asked is, are you hungry? Can we feed you? You barely had a chance to say yes or no before they're making tea or something and making something to eat so that you guys could eat together. Eating together was one of the strongest ways of building relationships, and all of our communities had that with each other, and nobody starved. And so it also gave people a chance to not only witness each other's kindness, but like I said, it built a good foundation in the community too. And the hunters, the fishers, they would all share whatever they got. If they got geese, if they got moose, or if they got fish, the first thing they would do is take some to some elders first, like their grandparents, and then the other elders that may not have that kind of support. And the young people would watch us, and they would learn. They would learn from their parents and their uncles as they went out and as they became hunters and trappers. So I pray that comes back too, again, not only for our First Nations communities, but all of our communities, that we can just practice sharing some warmth and kindness with each other. So that's how I'll be praying. And I'll do that through a song. In our language, we say Nagamo, but it doesn't really translate into singing. That's a assimilated, colonized version, I guess, of the word, but the word comes from Nugawi Ayamo. Nugamo means our mother is speaking. We're talking about our first mother of the earth, the one that provides us with so much medicine and bounty. Everything that we need is on Mother Earth, and thank you to Creator for ensuring that all these good spirits came here so that they can take care of the human family. And I pray that we can all learn how to do that work together. So I ask if you, while you're listening to the song, the opening song, that in your own way, whatever you're comfortable with, that you also maybe pray in this way also for all of you guys today. And ask him to say Manatu, Kike, Pimats, and Nina. Can you ask him now? I'm Sumanana, Kakio, the Kumanana. Can you ask him now? Kakio, Poagna, Creator. I give thanks to life and all the blessings of life. Thank you to all the grandmothers and grandfathers from all the directions, and to all of our spiritual helpers from all the directions. I ask Creator with gratitude and humility to allow those grandmothers and grandfathers to listen to our hearts and minds today as we try our best to understand the path forward to good life. Creator, I say prayers for all of our friends here today that are joining us here in this medium, and ask for goodness in their life, and that whatever challenges may be facing them are removed in a kind way, in a good way, so that they can offer the best of themselves to their families, so that they can offer the best of themselves to each other, and so that they can offer the best of themselves to the work that they're intended to do. Creator, once again, I say thanks for life and all the blessings of life. Sorry about that. We did this prayer there, and that's it. Done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a wonderful Wonderful way to open and to begin. Thank you, to ground us in this conversation and to remind us of the importance of this conversation and just of what we can call upon to guide us and to guide our hearts as we enter into being together for the next hour and a bit. So thank you very much for those wise words, the wise song.
Thank you. Have a good day. I'll see you guys another time, maybe.
And thank you to everyone that is here. So I want to start by looking a little bit. We have just a word cloud just at identifying what hats we're wearing today. And I was reminded in the chat that not everyone is necessarily from Treaty 1 territory, that we do have people joining us from across Turtle Island, across Canada, this nation we now call Canada. And so we're coming from different places, and we can see some of the different hats that people are wearing: community advocates, dietitians, students, food security, health coordinators from Manitoba Métis Federation. So we've got a number of different people coming from a number of different places, all coming into this conversation today. And we also want to now switch over to get right into our conversation and introduce our panelists. So we have 3 panelists joining us here today that are going to be bringing their wisdom to this conversation. And so our first panelist is Evelyn Forget, and she is to my left. I'm not sure where she appears for everyone else. Evelyn, if you could wave, thank you. So Evelyn is a professor of community health sciences at the University of Manitoba here in Winnipeg, or I am here in Winnipeg. Her research examines the health and social implications of poverty and inequality. And she has just recently published a new book. It's just come out. I know it was just a launch here in Winnipeg, I believe just last week, on basic income, called Radical Trust, Basic Income for Difficult Lives. And so this is an area that Evelyn has researched for a number of years. Our second panelist is Kirsten Bernas. And Kirsten is a director of housing at the West Central Women's Resource Center here in Winnipeg. She's also the chair of the provincial working group, the Right to Housing Coalition, and sits on the steering committee for Make Poverty History Manitoba. Kirsten, maybe you can just wave to everyone. That's Kirsten. And our third panelist is Meaghan Erbus. And Meaghan is a senior manager of the Community Food Network and advocacy at Harvest Manitoba. In her role, she works with the community to share food, advocate, and contributes to community-based research. And so I'm very delighted to be able to gather with this group to have this conversation today, and excited for all the people that I know are here together. So I want to not spend too much time just furthermore setting it up. It really just gives a chance to jump in. I think I will just say that I think food security, during the pandemic, I think food security we become much more aware about food security and food insecurity over the past 18, 20 months. Many more people, I think, have had a personal experience of food insecurity over this time with the challenges that people have been experiencing. And there's just much more awareness. And I think just with what we've seen is happening in BC right now, with looking at supply lines, at connections between the East and West being cut off. I know in my mind there is now, what is that going to further do to food security? So I think this has been and continues to be a really important conversation. But I think, as we've seen over the pandemic, that really one of the issues has been that business as usual is maybe not the answer anymore, and that the pandemic and where we are at maybe has opening some windows for some different ways of thinking and challenging how we've been working at food security. And so that's part of this conversation today, to really look at what are some different ways of thinking about this, and bringing to the conversation the idea of the basic income, and what could a basic income do to maybe get at some of the root causes and help get at the root causes of food insecurity. And so that's what we'll really be delving into together for the next hour. So just a reminder as we get started, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat so that we can capture those and make sure that we get those addressed. And so I want to start just by we've see the hats that the people who are in our virtual room with us, some of the hats that people are wearing. And I just want to give it give our chance to each of our panelists just to say a few words about the hats that they are wearing and bringing to this conversation before we jump into our questions. So Evelyn, I'll just pass over to you first, just to introduce yourself and just let us know what hat you're wearing.
Only a single hat today. I'm joining you from Treaty 1 territory. I am in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba, and I'm a health economist. And I've been working on the idea of basic income for a very, very long time. I think that food security requires that we address income security in a really profound and really radical, I think, way. And that's the hat I'm wearing today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Kirsten.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really happy to be a part of the discussion and really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists as well. So I spend most of my working days at West Central Women's Resource Center here in Winnipeg. I'm the director of housing there. So I manage our housing programs where we work primarily with women experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness. And across the board, food insecurity is an issue for the women in our housing programs and most of the women that access our drop-in center. And so we take a multi-level approach. We offer emergency services at the same time that we do the systems change work. And so because of that, I'm able to participate in our public policy advocacy coalitions. And that's, as Cynthia mentioned, with Make Poverty History Manitoba and the Right to Housing Coalition, where we try to get some of those government policies to act in a way that can get at the root causes so that we don't have to exist as a community agency that's providing emergency services.
Thank you. And Meaghan.
Hi, everyone. As Cynthia mentioned, my name is Meaghan Erbus. Super happy to be here. I'm the senior manager of our community food network and advocacy at Harvest. And I work with the network that is comprised of our agencies, food banks, folks that we share food with, and then the community that accesses our food banks, as well as doing advocacy with those folks to further bring their voices out so they can be heard about the issues that directly affect them. I bring to the conversation the perspective of someone who works in a food bank and that has frontline experience working with community. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have three different panel questions, and we'll go through the first two, and then after that, before we get to the third, there'll be an opportunity for people to ask questions. We wanted to start a little bit, get our conversation going first. And so before I pose the first question to our panel, just want to have a couple of clarifying definitions. And so one of the things we're talking about is really the emergency food programs. The approach in Canada to food insecurity is we have a very large reliance on emergency food programs, or what we kind of call a charity model. We're talking food relief programs, as Meaghan mentions, food banks, soup kitchens, hamper programs, sometimes school feeding programs. It's really community center ways to give food to those who need it. It may be food today, food for just this week, but it's not necessarily a long-term solution. But for many people, household food security, insecurity, it's not really about food. And so a lot of the solutions, the charity model is about immediate access to food. If someone doesn't have food and here's access to food for today. But for food security, as Evelyn just mentioned in her introduction to herself, we're talking about it's insufficient income. That in Canada, largely we rely on money to buy our food. That's the model that we have right now. And so insufficient income and material deprivation is really underlies very much food insecurity. And so when there isn't enough food, it's often there, we're making choices about what needs can be met. And so the first question we really want to talk about is why. There's two questions, but then they kind of go together, and really want to get this understanding of why we have this emergency model in Canada, this emergency food distribution model. Why does this model persist? Why is this the model that we have predominantly in Canada to deal with food insecurity? And why do we continue to see governments investing so heavily in emergency food programs to solve food insecurity? I think we've certainly seen that over the pandemic. There has been this emergency need, and there has been attention given to providing emergency food. But why is that the model that we continually go to? So maybe Kirsten, I'll start with you. I'll let you open up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I think these models persist because we're not adequately addressing poverty by investing in our social programs. So that it obviously includes income supports, but also things like public housing, subsidized childcare, affordable transportation, and accessible mental health services. Most of the women we work with at the Women's Center, who are experiencing poverty are on employment and income assistance. That's our local social assistance program. First of all, it's really hard for people sometimes to get onto EIA. There's a lot of documentation required that can create a lot of barriers. Many of the women we work with are not on EIA. They haven't managed to walk through that process, especially a lot of the women experiencing homelessness. Those that are able to get onto the EIA program here often just end up getting trapped in the program and trapped in poverty because the rates that are provided are just so low. And housing costs alone take up most of that budget because most people have to look to the private market to rent. Our wait list for Manitoba housing is quite long. There's over, I think, 4,000 households on that right now. And there are top-ups available to help pay for rent through a new benefit, but they're not universal or available to everybody. So we absolutely need more social housing where people can move into and have affordable housing. But even with that, and with your housing expenses kind of covered through that way, when you're on EIA, if you're a single person, you're only left with $195 to pay for everything else, right? Your clothes, toilet paper, medications, money for transportation, and food, right? So we obviously need some kind of livable basic needs benefit, at least as part of our EIA program, compared to what it is now. And so, yeah, I think our social assistance programs as is are definitely perpetuating the emergency food distribution model because people simply don't have enough money under that program left to purchase food for themselves and their families. And I think changes to that system could help address food insecurity for sure. But it's not just EIA, it's also like our economy that's perpetuating it, right? So we have so many working poor due to inadequate minimum wages, not enough good paying jobs, good quality full-time jobs. Childcare is unaffordable, transportation is unaffordable, and of course the lack of affordable housing. And so we need to look at all of this, I think, if we're going to address food insecurity. And if we don't, the model will persist. And to sort of answer like, well, why are we not doing that then? I mean, it's tricky, like there's obviously a need, I think, for both. People do need food and access to basic services now. And so those emergency services are playing an important role. And like I say, we do both at the center, but why are we not doing both in a good enough way when we think about what our governments are doing? I wonder sometimes if investing in emergency responses is maybe more politically popular or easier. People can easily understand the need for people to have access to food. People are familiar, with bringing a tin for the bin or, so when our governments invest in these emergency responses, I think most people get it and they accept it. But for some reason, people seem to have a harder time when it comes to investments in things like income supports for people living in poverty. Maybe that's just a perception that people feel this way about these kinds of investments, but it does seem to create a barrier for action. And I also think just like investing in these emergency responses is just part of this, general trend where governments are increasingly placing a growing burden, largely on nonprofit organizations, the charitable sector, to sort of step in and fill gaps that our governments are leaving behind from just decades of neoliberal austerity policies. As you mentioned, we operate like heavily under this charitable model, and it relies on donations of things like food, clothing, and on nonprofits to provide them. And it's never really worked well enough to meet the demand. And like you said, it like during the pandemic, it feels now more than ever we're seeing the flaws in that approach. At the height of the pandemic here, you know, donations went down. I know Winnipeg Harvest was struggling. I'm sure Meaghan could speak to that. Our nonprofits had to drastically limit their services, and people experiencing poverty were left in even greater crisis. And this is what happens when we rely on a charitable model rather than a proper social safety net that provides people who need it with a basic income, affordable housing, and other basic services that enable them to be food secure. So yeah, I think governments continue to try to solve issues like food insecurity by investing in emergency responses because it more easily fits within that neoliberal austerity agenda. Although they have spent quite a lot of money through that approach anyway, so I think it ought to be reconsidered. I'll leave it at that.
Meaghan, I'm interested in then turning it over to you, because Kirsten just kind of mentioning just very much that frontline service and working for Winnipeg Harvest. You are part of that front line. So from your perspective at Harvest, why does this emergency food model persist, and why are governments still investing in this to solve food insecurity?
Right. So I mean, we all work so closely together. So I'll go from my notes, but I imagine I'm going to repeat a lot of the things that Kirsten had said. But when we Harvest Manitoba asked our community why they have been getting food from a food bank, 76% rather have said that it was because they're not able to make ends meet. So meaning that they don't have enough money to be able to purchase food on their own. The majority, so what 80% of people make less than $20,000 a year, with nearly half of them saying that they had to miss a meal in order to pay for something else, like the things that Kirsten had mentioned, rent, so on. 78% of our people who access Harvest are on EIA, much like West Central Women's Resource Center, with very small proportion being employed, so about 18%. The social services that are put in place to help people are failing, and food banks and other community-based resources are filling the gaps. Sort of like Kirsten again mentioned, our current numbers haven't been this high. So currently this month's numbers are over 80,000 individuals accessing our services since the beginning of the pandemic. So we've seen sort of an increase back in March of the beginning of the pandemic, and now again, leading up to Christmas currently. And we've seen an influx of new clients. Over the last 2 months, we saw a 70% increase in comparison to the same 2 months last year. So people are citing again that the reason why they're accessing our services for the first time ever, or coming back after a certain amount of years, because they don't have enough money to make ends meet. So why do I think that governments continue to invest in food programs? I think that the amount of money that is required to invest in people is greater than what the government is willing to spend or able to spend. I think that a balanced budget requires them, like the government, to take money from one program and give it to another, or perhaps canceling a program that already exists. In return, they provide funds to folks like Harvest or other community-based organizations that just like touch the surface, I should say, of the issue to fill a gap. And also, and I will say that I think we do really good work with what we get. So I don't want to completely say that that's not useful. I think in terms of meeting this immediate need that I just spoke to, it's important. But certainly these funds don't reach people in the same way as cash would. It results in people having to figure out what to do and to literally exhaust all other resources before, and then still look for other things to do. So, whether that be like find a job, if that's something that somebody can do, or literally just deal with it, which is unfortunate and the reality for many folks. Thanks.
Thank you. So Evelyn, turn it over to you, because as a health economist, you've been obviously, as you said, looking at this, this issue from a health economics perspective for a long time. So why from your perspective does this emergency food model persist?
I think you're going to find all your panelists agreeing with one another for the next hour and a half. I agree absolutely with the things that Kirsten and Meaghan said. EIA pays less than half the poverty rate to adults without kids, less than half the poverty rate. You know, you've got people living on less than $10,000 a year in the city, sometimes substantially less than $10,000 a year. We have a low-wage economy. We have people who are working in precarious jobs with no guarantee of hours, no guarantee of how many hours they can expect over the next month. So the economy perpetuates low-wage, precarious work. Our social programs don't provide enough for people to live even modestly reasonable lives. So that's why we have this problem. People simply don't have enough money. Now, I'm going to sound like an economist for a minute, because the one thing about money is that it's this magic substance that can be turned into whatever it is people think they need to improve their lives. They can spend that money on food, they can spend the money on housing, they can spend the money on transportation, they can spend it on what they need today, rather than spending all of their time and trying to access a service that will meet their needs at a particular point in time. So I think we need adequate income supports for people. If people had adequate income supports, we wouldn't do away with the need for emergency food services, but we would definitely reduce the kind of deep poverty that we're trying to treat through these programs.
And so, and Evelyn, why, in your perspective, why do governments keep investing in?
Well, here I'm going to take a slightly more radical stance. I think the reason governments keep investing in these kinds of programs is because it's much, much more challenging to empower people to make their own decisions about how to live their own lives. If you give people money, they won't necessarily behave in ways that the governments want them to behave. They won't necessarily behave in ways that are acceptable to the dominant culture in a society. Do we want to give people money even if they're not available for work? Do we want to make sure that people have adequate incomes if they're not prepared to attend training programs that some caseworker believes that they should attend to make them more employable? Those are the kinds of questions we need to ask ourselves. What are the circumstances under which we're prepared to give people money? Are we prepared to give people money that they can spend any way that they want to? And I think the answer is for a lot of governments, that's a very challenging kind of thing to think about. And I think it's very challenging for many Canadians to think about.
This is so what is the evidence? I'm going to kind of go a bit off script here, but I'm just wanting to, as an economist, what is the evidence on actually people who are very food insecure not using cash to buy food? Is that a real concern? Where's the evidence? Is that
absolutely
really,
not?
Or
absolutely
is that just a perspective that isn't based in evidence?
I think it's not based in evidence at all. I think that if people have money, they spend the money in reasonable ways to improve their quality of life. Every time it's been tried, every time people receive money, they spend it on what you expect them to spend it on. They spend it on better housing. They spend it on accessing food. They spend it on the sorts of things that anybody would spend money on. So it's not a real fear, but I think that there is a belief in many circumstances that we need to coerce people to behave in particular ways. If we're going to hand money out to people, if we're going to really do something about income security, are we really prepared to give up our focus on controlling their behavior? And I think that that's something we need to ask ourselves.
Kirsten or Meaghan, do either of you want to sort of jump in there on that perspective, in terms of, especially if you're working very much on front lines with people, that question of whether or not is this a real issue about perceptions of what people are going to do, people not being able to make good decisions, and you see people making decisions in very difficult circumstances on a daily basis. So yeah, Meaghan, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I would say that we've seen that in respect to when we had clients coming into our building on the 20th of every month, it would look very different and it would be empty in terms of folks needing to access our services during that time frame. And I know for sure folks that have accessed CPP or have started to take on CPP rather than, or moving from EIA rather to CPP, no longer come to Harvest anymore to access our services, or to, or volunteer out of the goodness of their heart, but not to receive the volunteer benefit that you receive. If you're someone on EIA disability, you get this this increased benefit, where lots of folks used to get that. People continue to do it because they want to, but not because they had to. So there's these sort of systems that ultimately change the way in which people decided to make decisions on how they purchase things. And then I guess, again, just by, knowing that there is, there's influx of clients all the time, but people come on and come off. So a requirement of asking somebody whether they're a new client or not is based on whether or not they haven't accessed our services in 2 years. And so we often see folks, and especially in the beginning of the pandemic, people not using our services for a really long time and then starting to again for a bit, and then leaving us for a while and then coming back when they need us. So it means that whatever's happening in their lives changed. They didn't need us, they didn't use us, and then so I would only assume that that has to do with the relationship that they have with their income. So,
Kirsten, did you want to add anything on that?
I mean, I don't think I have anything really new to add, maybe other than because we see the same thing. And I definitely think the perception is there despite what we see and experience. But I think that's part of the problem, is that many of the folks who have the power to sort of make decisions around what to do and where to invest don't see that directly and don't experience it. And it's creates some kind of barrier for them to believing and to be believing in it. So not sure, there's maybe some things that we could be doing about that in our advocacy, or just how we build relationships with decision makers and bringing them into the worlds that we are exposed to every day. And I know a lot of groups are doing that, but I think there's more work to do.
Thank you. So I want to move us into just our second set of questions, just really getting into the meat of basic income, of sort of the core of our conversation. Just what exactly is basic income? I think, for most of us, it's not, it's government supports, income supports, it's not a new idea. We've had mention of different types of programs that exist. And certainly we've seen during the pandemic with CERB and the CRB, some new programs, some new income support type programs, and those are just being phased out at this time. And we see, we have seen notable impacts. And so this is, I guess, the question, is basic income, how different is basic income from these programs? I think a lot of people, maybe when we hear basic income, we think we kind of know what that means, but then it's sort of, then you dig into it. Well, what do we really mean by basic income? What would that actually look like? So I think that's really the next question. We've got this general idea. We understand different income supports, different programs. When we talk about a basic income, what would that actually look like? What could that actually look like? What would be the central components of a successful basic income program? And how would it impact? How do we think it would impact food security to have a basic income program? So really those two questions. What would this look like? For, what would be some of the core components of a basic income program? And how do we think that would impact food security? So Evelyn, maybe I'll start with you on that one. Just what would this look like?
Sure. I think I should say before I begin that basic income is really just money. It doesn't replace necessary services that people need. So it's not a replacement for social housing. It's not a replacement for investments in the healthcare system and so on. It's just money. We do have programs that are sort of like basic incomes in Canada. Meaghan mentioned just a minute ago the OASGIS. For seniors, we've got the Canada Child Benefit. These are both forms of basic income. So in Canada, when we talk about a basic income, we're usually talking about a guaranteed minimum income model. And what that means is that if somebody appears and they have no money from any other source, as they might if they're applying for EIA, for example, they get a guarantee, and that guarantee is going to be somewhere close to the poverty line. So in a city like Winnipeg, we're talking about somewhere close to $22,000, as opposed to less than half that, which is what they get on EIA. It's available to people with income from no other source, but the other thing about basic income is that it's also available to low-waged working people. So if you're working and you're not earning enough to get yourself above the poverty line, you'd receive a partial benefit. So the guarantee is $22,000. If you go out and work, your benefit's reduced, but it's reduced by less than you're earning. So it gradually tails out until it disappears altogether at middle and upper incomes. So it's available both as a replacement for EIA and a supplement for low-waged working people. So what other programs would it replace? I think it would replace EIA. It would replace some of the programs that the various levels of government have in place to provide cash to low-waged people. What makes it different from EIA? So far, it just sounds like a minor revision of the EIA program and a raise in the rates. And I think that there are some things that make it different. First of all, it's adequate, right? It needs to be set at a level where people can actually be expected to live a modest life, but to live with a little bit of dignity. Secondly, it's regular and predictable. So your income doesn't change dramatically from month to month because there was some rule you didn't know existed that you've somehow broken and you will be penalized for. The money's regular, it's predictable, it comes regularly. And most important of all, it's unconditional. And when I say it's unconditional, the only thing it depends on is your income from other sources. It doesn't depend on your behavior. So you're not required to make yourself available to go to work at any job that might be available to you. You're not required to submit a certain number of resumes every month. You're not required to attend training programs. The money's there and it's yours and you can do with it what you like. You don't have to produce receipts to demonstrate that you're spending the money in particular ways. It's your money, spend it any way you like. And finally, it's delivered with dignity, right? We don't need the kinds of humiliations that are routine for many people when they apply for EIA or for disability support. The money's available and it's delivered in a sort of simple and straightforward way in the same way that CERB was delivered during the pandemic. It's easy to apply for and the money appears really very quickly. So that's sort of what a basic income would look like. And I think that one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is that it's possible to provide these kinds of supports to people when the political will is there to provide these kinds of supports. So I don't know. That's what a basic income would look like.
Meaghan, from your, it's just curious if that's what Meaghan, from your perspective, being at Winnipeg Harvest, what are there other elements that you can see that you from where you are that could be part of a basic income?
You know, Evelyn and I sit on the board of Basic Income Manitoba, so I feel like she hit that. She did a really good job with that definition. Obviously, she studies it, so I don't know that I have a ton to add other than just maybe reiterating a few things like the fact that folks that, as you know, you talked about these other sort of income transfers, CCB, CERB, all of those things, folks that access food banks also access those things or have those top ups to their income. So ensuring that a basic income is an investment in people and that it is set at an income level that is fair, just, and has no strings attached, as Evelyn just mentioned. Also, I love to think of it more of an opportunity for them to, as I mentioned, invest in people, but also without the requirement of instantaneous return. That it takes time for these things to kick in and to work. And so if the expectation is for it to just all of a sudden be different in a year or whatever that looks like, that they need to understand that investments take time. I will just mention that, like, in terms of folks that received the basic income in Ontario during their pilot program, they talked about putting more food in the fridge, saving money for the first time ever, or buying a new winter coat, which is something they could never do before. They only bought coats at thrift stores or so on, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but just something that was of value to them to be able to purchase this brand new thing. So again, touching on having the liberty to buy things for like what you want. And then again, the programs that I mentioned earlier are not stigmatized and based on income levels. So meaning if you have a higher income, you get less or none, and then they're easy to access because you're applying for it using either your tax information, and then it's evaluated or reevaluated annually. So with EIA, it's different, right? So yeah, so from a Harvest perspective, it would increase the livelihoods for sure of people if they were able to access something like that.
Kirsten, I want to give you a chance to jump in too, just in terms of if there's anything from your perspective on what, you know, what other components there might be to successful basic income, and just how basic income would maybe impact the food security for the women that you're working with that access the Women's Resource Center.
Yeah, so maybe just preface my comments by saying, like, I am nowhere close to being an expert on basic income. And it's been really great to hear from Meaghan and Evelyn around this. But I will answer the question. Do I think it would have an impact on food security? I think it certainly could. I think with this kind of a program, though, that the devil is really in the details, and we need to be careful when we're advocating for a basic income, because there's a lot of claims out there that a basic income is something that's, you know, supported across the political spectrum. But I think, you know, there's cause for some skepticism that everyone who supports it has sort of the same vision when it comes to this type of a program. And while I agree with Evelyn around the need for, you know, a benefit level that's adequate, that doesn't exist in a way that either replaces or, you know, causes deinvestment in social programs, I'm skeptical that everyone who supports a basic income across the political spectrum would agree with that. And so I think the design, the delivery, the adequacy of a BI program and what's at stake if we develop one really depends on the vision that we have for it. And, like, you know, what is the problem here that we're trying to address? And yeah, it sounds like there's different people out there maybe looking to implement it for different reasons. But if the vision is to address food insecurity, you know, we need to look at the impact it would have on poverty. And some of the key questions I wonder about are, you know, who would benefit if we were to implement a program, right? Would it be universal? We talked about how, you know, seniors and children have benefited greatly from, you know, the Canada Child Benefit, OAS and GIS. Would those folks be better off as a result? It kind of depends on how that program is implemented and the level, if it would replace those existing benefits or not. And then obviously the working poor, Evelyn touched on, and then there's everybody who depends on EIA, which is obviously terribly inadequate and needs to be, you know, improved or replaced. So maybe a more targeted programming focusing on, as Evelyn mentioned, the people that otherwise depend on EIA and the working poor would make sense. But then my next questions are around what the amount would be and how we would pay for it. So obviously we would need that level to be adequate and resourced. And the other question is how it would interact alongside other existing social programs. Like, can we assume that social housing, pharmacare, childcare, you know, expansion of worker benefits, all those things are going to be able to be maintained, or that people who are interested in a BI are also interested in maintaining and expanding those programs? Like, I'm worried some people will think then that are in favor of a BI will want to implement it to then say, we don't need to invest now in public housing or in subsidized childcare, for example, because people have money to pay for these things themselves. But if we start to, you know, eliminate or, you know, like cut back on these social programs and wait lists for these services expand, and if the amount people receive through a BI isn't set high enough to meet costs for these services in the private market, then I think we could be in some real trouble in terms of accessing services. And I really do question the amount that people would receive in, you know, the reality that we're living in, if it would be adequate, because most of the programs that have been piloted or even considered as to be piloted have not offered a benefit that lifts people up to the poverty line, never mind above it. So I'm not sure that just, you know, redistributing income through an income benefit, potentially increasing reliance on the private market, if that's the approach that our governments took for basic services, is actually going to reduce poverty, because people will still need access to those public services. You know, Armine Yelnizian, I don't know if she's still with the CCP or not. She's talked a lot about basic income and brought up a lot of these issues as well. And she would argue that, you know, we would do potentially better by investing in the expansion of our social programs to address poverty, because they can be amazingly redistributed. Like, if you look at our healthcare system as an example, of course, depending on how it's funded, And if we can look at things like housing and childcare and transportation as like things that we can give each other, as opposed to just, you know, an income benefit, then we can build a welfare system that provides basic services that not just help to address poverty, but really lifts everyone's quality of life, because they can benefit everyone. So having said all that, I believe, you know, EIA is one of these social programs that we can't ignore as part of this package of social welfare programs. And if we can look at basic income as either an enhancement or a replacement of our social assistance programs, both by increasing the benefits people receive and looking at changes that would address, you know, some of the punitive nature of these programs, the stigma associated with them, how, you know, the impact it has on dignity. If we can do that while also investing in our public services, then I think this approach could certainly go a long way to help address poverty and food insecurity. Like I said, we saw how the impact that the CCB had, GIS and OAS, and now the CERB. I don't know how well that's been documented, but there's got to be a better way of enhancing people's incomes than through a patchwork of programs. And maybe BI, if carefully designed and with the right intentions, then would be that sort of answer.
And this sort of follows one of the questions in the chat. It's sort of following just on what you're raising, Kirsten. Just so those questions. So what are some of the current voices or evidence against a program? It's a question that Evan is asking. What are the current voices or evidence against a program like a guaranteed minimum income? So if we, you know, the positives of having a guaranteed minimum income. What are and Evelyn, maybe you can say some from the research. What are some of the evidence against, or just voice the arguments against to try and understand what are the different perspectives?
Why there's a debate. Yeah. Sure. I do want to say a couple of things about a basic income. I have seen in the chat a couple of questions about cost as well, and I'd like to address that if I could. Mm-hmm. Where would the money come from for a basic income? This has been costed several times in Canada, 3 times by the Parliamentary Budget Office. And the Parliamentary Budget Office didn't eliminate any services to pay for it, but it did take some things like the GST credit on income tax and various other programs and rolled them into a basic income and replaced the equivalent of EIA across the country. And the net cost for basic income in Canada was $43 billion if you don't eliminate EIA and its counterparts. We pay $20 billion a year across the country for that. So the net cost of replacing those programs with the basic income would be $23 billion a year. Just to put that in some kind of perspective, we pay $23 billion a year for the Canada Child Benefit. We pay more than twice that for OAS, GIS. We're paying more than that for childcare services. So this is well within the range of other programs that we've decided we can afford in this country. So it is affordable. Why might people be opposed to the idea of a basic income? I think that one of the greatest criticisms of a basic income is that it would create work disincentives. So I think that the real fear on the part of many people is that people simply won't work if you offer them a basic income. There's no evidence to support that. This has been piloted a number of times in Canada, in middle-income countries, and low-income countries. And whenever you try it, the results are usually that it has a negligible effect on the number of hours that people work. In the Ontario pilot, many people reported that, in fact, they'd use the opportunity to move into better jobs. So they move from precarious part-time work into full-time work. So it creates opportunities for individuals, in fact, to improve their work conditions. There's very little evidence that people stop working if it's available. The other criticism is the cost, which I've just talked about. And then there's Armenia Alnesian's concerns that it will be detrimental to all other social services. And I think I'd like to just remind us that we haven't done a very good job of supporting those public services in all the years we've not had a basic income. It's taken us an awfully long time to get to the position we're at. And I think we can look around and say, you know, it's not very good. We don't have very good social housing. We don't have very much support in a lot of areas where we'd like to see more support. So the idea that a basic income would be detrimental, I think, is questionable. I think that it's an opportunity to improve people's people's living conditions. And I guess the other thing I'd like to comment on is where the support for basic income comes from. And I think much of the support for basic income in Canada actually comes from the healthcare sector. Healthcare providers are among the strongest advocates for a basic income. And one of the reasons they're such strong advocates for a basic income is because we see in our hospitals all the time the amount of money we're spending dealing with the consequences of poverty, dealing with health conditions that have been brought on from years of living in substandard housing and working in really bad jobs and living with inadequate diets and sleeping rough and all of those conditions. So I think that people who actually do work with people who would benefit from the basic income can see how it would improve their lives.
And Meaghan, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, do you hear other perspectives against a minimum guaranteed income, or?
I would say that I probably have heard similar arguments that both Kirsten and Evelyn have brought up. I think that in terms of, like, from a food bank perspective, from a harvest perspective, when we reach out and talk to our community, I was just looking at some stats really quickly. About 84% of the folks that access our services are unemployed, which speaks to a bigger issue around employment opportunities, jobs, good paying jobs. As I mentioned, there's a portion of folks that access our services that are employed. So that's certainly something that needs to be taken into consideration. But wouldn't it be great if folks could just be okay while they were looking for good, well-paying jobs? Would be my counter argument. And then another interesting statistic is that about 83% of the folks that we reached out to and asked, about 83% of our community has said that they have a disability or health condition that limits their ability to perform daily activities. So then we have this other proportion of folks that either are not able to find employment or unable to work for a variety of different reasons. And so ultimately need some sort of income to be able to meet their needs as well. So wouldn't it be great to give them an income, or give folks an opportunity to have an income that allows for them to work part-time but still be able to meet their basic needs? So again, I can't argue against all of these. I'm not an expert in advocacy, policy advocacy and pricing, economics, and all of that kind of stuff. I just know that as a person that works in a food bank, investing in folks, which means we've got to spend some money to do it, is what we need to do in order for this to make a difference, and certainly make a difference in food insecurity and in respect to the charity sector as it relates to food.
And before we move to our third question, I just want to give a chance to, we've had a few questions in the chat, but really give a chance to folks that are listening in to just pause and open it up to the conversation, to if all of you that are out there listening, it's I find this very odd to, like, I can't see any of you. I just trust that you're all still there. But if there's some questions that people would like to pose, listening to the conversation, are there questions from our audience that people would like to make sure we ask at this point? Just want to open it up to provide an opportunity for people to make sure that they're getting questions in. So just kind of want to pause and just see. I don't know, Katie or Olivia, if you can tell me if there's other questions that we've missed here, trying to monitor the chat and the conversation a bit. So if there's other questions that we should be trying to answer, if people want to ask at this time. So one of the questions, there's a question in the chat around, and this goes back to sort of our first question in some ways around guiding governments. Just the government perspective, one of the questions is, did government use the optics of these programs to get elected, or I guess maybe the risk of this, of governments promising things like basic income and then clawing them back once they're elected? Evelyn, maybe I'll pose that to you, just those questions of goes back to just the role of government and government's promising basic income and then that not happening. So what are maybe perspectives on how do we, and this maybe gets to our next question, but how do we advocate for this?
I'm enough of a cynic about politicians at this point that I think that a whole lot of polling goes into deciding what to support, and I think very little thought sometimes goes into sustained consideration about how we can address some real issues that we need to address. So they're pulled in a million different directions by a million different advocacy organizations, and what we've not been able to do is to work together to bring about the changes that I think are necessary to bring about. The government's focus on the saleability of particular programs, of course they do. Of course they do. And we see it all the time. We see it every time they introduce a new program. There's a tremendous amount of interest in that for a short period of time, and then the programs are starved, and we've got a whole lot of underfunded programs as a result. And so I think that one of the things we have to do as advocates in this sector is to figure out how we can work together to support one another. There has been, for a number of years, this perception of scarcity that's been created. It's been created by governments, it's been created by the society that we're living in. And it's created this situation where we believe that nothing is possible. Everything will be cut back, everything will be reduced. We can't make positive change, but positive change is possible. And we've brought about those changes. We've seen those changes over time. I think one of the greatest advances that's been made in recent years was the enhancement of child benefit. It's not a perfect benefit, not by any means, but it's certainly improved the lives of a whole lot of kids. That program's going nowhere. It's in place and it's there for the long term. And I think that those are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at to bring about change.
Another question that we have, and I think this is a really good question, kind of it's around just how would this work? Heather Love asks, can panelists comment on, are there models in other countries where who does this? Where are other places that maybe do this well and that are models that we can say, you know, here's where this model is working well? Do we have examples of other places around the world where basic income works well and that a Canadian model could be modeled after?
Actually, I think we've got a couple of really good models in Canada. We've got the OAS GIS system and we've got the Canada Child Benefit. There's currently work underway to bring about federal support for people with disabilities. So, I mean, I think that there is a movement towards these kinds of programs. I think that basic income, as a large-scale basic income program, has been piloted in a lot of places. There have been a couple of announcements since the pandemic began of programs that are being put in place, but there is no program that's been in place for a long period of time that deals with the entire population. So, I mean, I think that we can look to our own experience with these programs and see how we can. I mean, if we look at the real gap in the system, it really is for working age adults, people between 18 and 64. We need to do something about working age adults and income supports for working age adults. We can make improvements by bringing in components of the basic income program.
And there is a question though asking about for students. You're saying for working age adults, but what about for students? Within children within families, I guess that would maybe if their parents are accessing this, but supports even for that 16 to 18-year-old where you may you know not be part of a family in the same way. Is that how would this also address those, you know, how would in sort of that transition period, how would people.
I think that transition period is a tremendously important period. The book that you mentioned that just came out, it's called Radical Trust: Basic Income for Complicated Lives. And one of the groups of people we looked at were kids aging out of foster care, kids who didn't have parental supports. And one of the things we've seen across the country in recent years is the introduction of extended benefits for children, for young people in this category. And I could see in many ways that some students would fall into that same category. So I think it's a matter of filling in the gaps in the programs that we already have in place and creating something better as a result.
So for our last, we have about 15 minutes left together. I want to just go to our third series of questions, just kind of get a little bit into sort of how can we advocate? How could that next step to go beyond, we just talked about, government, so you promised this, but what are things to try and really advocate and keep pressure, maybe create pressure? I think we do have, there is this feeling, I know, of there is a moment now. So the question really is, how can the community sector, how can we really encourage government to shift away from the charity food assistance model and really take a basic income seriously? And what do we need to do? What does the community need to do to advocate to make this a reality? What kind of pressure can we apply to government so that it's not just an election promise that is kind of forgotten soon after? What are ways that we could work as a community together to really advocate and apply longer, concerted and longer term pressure to make this a reality? Meaghan or Evelyn, I'll start with you.
Unmute myself for a minute. I think that what we need to do in this sector is to recognize the commonalities in our goals and to work together when that's possible. I think that marginalized people only make advances. People who need help only receive that help when we can work together to bring about change. And I think that that's essential. I think we're seeing it in some quarters, and I guess I'd like to encourage the opportunity to do that whenever possible. I think sometimes we get overwhelmed by the number of problems walking in our door. And I can imagine in particular when your whole life is involved in providing services on the front line to people who are in desperate straits, it's really hard to take 6 steps back and to say, how can I address some of these problems upstream? It's really, really hard to do that. And I think that's what needs to be done. And I'm encouraged by some of the movements that I see by attempts to address those issues.
Kirsten, from where you sit, how can the community come together to advocate for basic income?
Well, I think we need to look beyond just the basic income. I think we need to obviously be talking about the root causes of food insecurity and what the real solutions are. And economic security is obviously a huge part of that, right? So we do need to look at income support programs, but we also need to be advocating for things around the labor market and adequate wages, investments in childcare. But the income piece is super important so that people can meet their basic needs and not be living in this sort of constant state of crisis while they're trying to access their basic needs, to be able to start to begin to move down a path towards, financial independence, if that's what the goal is for folks. And affordable housing is another key piece of the sort of economic security piece, I think. And so how can the community influence this? I think here in Manitoba, we've been a part of examples of that actually happening. Since I've been involved with the Right to Housing Coalition and Make Poverty History Manitoba, those are groups that are bringing together people who care about these issues. They ran a successful campaign that got our provincial government to create 1,500 units each of social and affordable housing over 5 years. That was under the previous NDP government back in 2009. Make Poverty History Manitoba, they ran a campaign around the same time to increase our welfare rates here. And they took the approach of focusing on the shelter benefit that people receive. And it led to a program called Rent Assist that where in the past people on EIA would receive $285 to rent in the private market. A single person on EIA's general assistance now gets $576, and that, you know, it had a huge impact. And then just today, actually, Make Poverty History Manitoba that has a city working group that has been advocating to our city of Winnipeg to create a poverty reduction strategy, comprehensive poverty reduction strategy. And it's been a 4-year process, but today, the Executive Policy Committee at City Council unanimously passed the City of Winnipeg's first ever poverty reduction strategy. So I think there is a lot of hope, and we've shown that the community can do this. How were we successful in those initiatives? I mean, really, they took like sustainable and, you know, public advocacy campaigns. We developed a clear ask with a solid case for implementing that ask and a timeline that we wanted action to be taken by. And we started by, you know, spending time quietly sort of building our support base for this so that when we launched our campaigns, we could demonstrate that we had really broad support for what we were asking for. We carried forward an internal sort of advocacy campaign with political leaders and met with them, with the folks who are responsible for making those decisions, at the same time that we led a really public campaign where we engaged our supporters to provide sort of sustained public pressure for government. So letter writing campaigns and holding rallies at the Ledge, bringing strategic supporters into meetings we would have with political leaders. And we also engaged the media, which I think was super important along the way, through, you know, just different kind of stunts or events that we would pull together that the media would come out to and cover, you know, the story of the need to increase social assistance rates or provide social housing in a sustainable way until it just really couldn't be ignored. And of course, there's always, you know, political moments that happen as part of this that you kind of get lucky, and you sometimes get the right person in the right place at the right time in government who can make these decisions, or a leadership election, or, you know, a broader election where people kind of leaders are making commitments that they might not otherwise make, and that helped in some cases. But that's kind of the approach that has worked for those examples that I gave. These larger campaigns have been difficult in the last several years under the Conservative government. We've had to be really reactionary to a lot of the policies they've implemented that are taking steps backwards in these areas. You know, so we've shifted our housing campaign from new units to stop selling the units we already have, right? And it's sort of taken away from our ability to make progress. But during that time, we really focused on doing public education then, so that once, you know, we did have a more sympathetic government in place, we'd have a stronger base of power to push for these things. The pandemic's made that sort of engagement with people kind of difficult. But I think we need to start looking at more creative ways of doing that too. Like, how can we tap into the ways that folks who, you know, are already participating in some ways, whether by making donations or like volunteering in places, how can we provide more information or opportunities that might help them take the next step or be interested in taking the next step into participating in these bigger systems change, public policy advocacy campaigns. I think now that we're approaching probably a provincial election in the not too far future here in Manitoba, our coalition work anyways is going to start to maybe look at some of these broader campaigns to see if maybe that poses an opportunity to gain some traction. But yeah, that's kind of from, you know, where I'm sitting with the work that I'm doing, how we've done things and where we're looking to go.
And Meaghan, from your perspective, how can the community sector advocate to this, you know, advocate for basic income, for shifting to sort of these longer term solutions and supports to address food insecurity?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, I don't have a ton to add after both my friendly panelists here have already spoken to so many good things. But I would say that we need to continue to insist on having people living with a low income be at the table when we discuss potential policy. I think that they need to ensure, or we need to ensure rather, that the results of the policy advocacy that we're doing will benefit the community. And that, you know, as sort of Kirsten and just mentioned, that we need to educate people, you know, about our respective organizations and what we do, so that we can continue to bring those voices and those stories forward. So housing, food banks, universities. And like, I appreciate all the rungs of the ladder of engagement, and would, you know, encourage folks to, you know, reach out to Make Poverty History Manitoba to continue the conversation around their campaign around a livable basic needs benefit. So it's a portable benefit that would work with our current EIA system as a means to sort of you know, a stepping stone to a basic income. And then I would encourage folks, if they're interested in a basic income, to reach out to Basic Income Manitoba to help us further our conversations around this, and look to ways in which, yeah, we can further get this information out to people. Yeah, maybe make those big systems changes, right? So yeah, like Kirsten, my experience working with government has been continuing to share the stories of the folks that we serve, and certainly those from a food bank perspective. And as I've sort of highlighted throughout this panel, it's really has been around income and a variety of other reasons, but that first and foremost is the reason why they access our services is because they don't have enough money to make ends meet. And so finding a way to, you know, make that happen will hopefully, you know, enhance the lives of folks that are accessing our services. And that's really what we want to do. So that's all I have to say about that.
We just have about 5 minutes left. So before we close, I just want to give each of the panelists, just if there's the closing comment or closing thought you'd like to make, just to leave the conversation today. Just want to give everyone a final chance, just to, there's something that hasn't come up, or just one final comment that you may want to make just in closing before we wrap up. So Evelyn, I'll start with you. Is there a final thought you want to leave us with today?
Sure. I think I'd like to go right back to the beginning. When Bobby was talking at the beginning and he introduced it, he talked about life and food being about spirit as well as physical. And he encouraged us all to bring a bit of kindness to the discussion. And I think those are great words to live with.
Absolutely. We're really, I know that really touched me, just that thought of, you know, when we gather, we always share food, and that's part of what this, you know, getting down to the heart of what we're talking about. Kirsten, is there something, a final comment you'd like to leave us with, or an idea, something you maybe haven't had a chance to bring, or just want to close on?
Maybe just a couple quick things. One, I just posted in the, maybe a bit of a plug, I posted in the chat about a rally, speaking of rallies, at the Legislative Building in Winnipeg on Monday, if people want to come out and are able to come out and support in favor of social housing. Yeah, and I think maybe just a general point around, you know, in terms of community getting involved in making these changes. We always need more folks like participating in that kind of work and interested in doing that sort of public education and public policy advocacy. And so any way that if you're interested in any way that you're able to get involved in that in your local communities, wherever that is, that's really awesome. And then I think maybe just for the record, I want to reiterate that with my comments around basic income, that I don't want to give the impression that I am not in favor of basic income at all. I do think it is important for us to be really careful about how we advocate for that, and that we are ensuring that we can achieve a basic income in a way that you know, is not at the expense of some of the other social programs that we all really benefit from. Yeah, so thanks very much for having me here.
And Meaghan, will let you have a chance for our last thought as well. If you have last ideas you wanted to add in before we wrap up.
I just want to thank everyone for having me and for listening. You know, Harvest advocates for Manitoba where nobody goes hungry. And so we want to share food with people that need it and continue to advocate for long-lasting change in the lives of people who are accessing our services. So yeah, I mean, I think I've said all I can say about what's going on in the landscape of our life here from food banks. But yeah, I just appreciate everybody taking the time to listen and being engaged in this conversation. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So before we close, just want to for everyone that's listening in, give a chance for people to tell us about what what you want to learn more about. So if you can go back to your browser, go back to menti.com, and you'll see a new question. Again, the code is 12682036. And if you could just tell us what you want to learn more about, what are some things that you would maybe like to learn more about, what some ideas that have maybe been sparked in you listening to this conversation, and if there's more topics that we'd like to learn more about, we'd love to know about that. And I wanted to say, if you want to continue to connect around this issue, if there's questions that you've encountered today and they really sparked your interest, you want to know more about, Food Matters Manitoba, has a food action hub, which is a place where we can gather as community to talk about the issues of food security and how we can address food security in Manitoba, but more broadly as well. And so please, we invite you to check out the Food Action Hub and to use this as a place where we can hopefully continue some of this conversation that we've had today. I really want to thank all of our panelists for the time that they've taken to join us today, to Evelyn, Kirsten, and Meaghan. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your knowledge and your ideas and your enthusiasm that you've brought to the conversation today. Also really want to thank Bobby for his wonderful words of wisdom in grounding us and opening us today. I know I found this conversation really inspiring. I think Evelyn, you said that in the beginning, that really a basic income is really about income. It's money, it's only money, but it is a core piece. And I think, Kirsten, you really highlighted that it's not the only piece. And this is a complex issue. Food insecurity is a complex issue. There's not one silver bullet. A guaranteed income. Meaghan, you talked about the people that are coming, that are coming to the food bank. It is a lack of income. So this is a clear, really important piece, but it's not going to be the only solution. It's one piece that we definitely need to keep talking about and understanding how we can maybe make this a reality, but not forgetting about the other pieces that we need to address this complex problem. And I think addressing, remembering, as Bobby talked about, that this is not just an income. This is a soul problem. This is a spirit problem, and that food connects us and nourishes us in all sorts of ways. And so keeping that understanding of its income, but it's also all the ways that food nourishes us that needs to be part of the conversation. And so I want to thank everyone who has joined us online today, for listening into the conversation and for your questions. And we hope that we can continue the conversation, as I say, on the Food Action Hub. And just want to thank everyone for your time and attention and energy. And be well and enjoy the rest of your evening. And I hope everyone can gather. We can gather again and continue the conversation. So thank you.